Hey guys, tonight we're exploring one of history's most perfectly ironic moments, the time when Thales of Miletus, one of the world's first philosophers and scientists, fell into a well because he was too busy looking at the stars. From the beaches of ancient Ionia to the bottom of a very embarrassing hole, this is the story of a man who tried to understand the cosmos and discovered that sometimes the ground beneath your feet matters more than the heavens above. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe adjust your pillows one more time, and let's journey back to ancient Greece, where philosophy was just being invented and workplace safety was entirely optional. We're in Miletus, a prosperous Greek city on the coast of what's now Turkey, around 580 BCE. The city sits where the Meander River meets the Aegean Sea, a perfect location for trade, culture, and, apparently, for producing people who ask difficult questions about the nature of reality. The streets are busy with merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and the occasional philosopher wandering around looking confused about basic navigation. Thales is already famous, or as famous as anyone can be in a world without social media or publishing houses. He's known for several things: predicting a solar eclipse, which was either brilliant astronomy or very lucky guessing; proposing that water is the fundamental substance of the universe, which is at least more interesting than saying, "I don't know," and generally being the kind of person who thinks about things that most people are too busy surviving to contemplate. He's not young anymore, somewhere in his 50s or 60s, depending on which ancient source you trust, and trust is a flexible concept when your primary sources were written centuries after the events they describe. He has the look of someone who spends more time thinking than eating, thin and weathered, with the permanent squint of a person who stares at distant objects more than nearby ones. His reputation as a wise man is well established. People come to him with questions about mathematics, astronomy, navigation, philosophy, and probably also questions like, "Where did I leave my sandals?" that he's less equipped to answer. He's one of the 7 sages of Greece, a title that sounds impressive until you realize it mostly means people expect you to say wise things at dinner parties. The story that will define him, at least in terms of amusing anecdotes that survive for millennia, happens on an ordinary evening. Thales is walking, as he often does, lost in thought about celestial mechanics, or the nature of substance, or whatever philosophers think about when they're not paying attention to where they're going. The sky above Miletus is spectacular tonight. No light pollution, no city glow, just thousands of stars visible in crisp detail. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness like a river of light, which is actually what the Greeks thought it was, a celestial stream flowing through the heavens. Constellations that Thales has studied for decades wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. He's particularly interested in navigation stars tonight. Miletus is a seafaring city, and Thales has been working on methods for using celestial observations to determine position and direction. He's told sailors to navigate by Ursa Minor instead of Ursa Major, which is either brilliant astronomy or completely wrong depending on whether it actually helps anyone get where they're going. As he walks, his head is tilted back at an angle that would give modern chiropractors anxiety. He's tracking the movement of stars, making mental calculations about their positions, trying to understand the mathematics underlying celestial motion. The Greeks believed the stars are fixed to a great sphere that rotates around the Earth, which is wrong but geometrically interesting. Thales is convinced that understanding the heavens is the key to understanding everything else. If you can figure out why stars move the way they do, why eclipses happen when they do, why seasons change in predictable patterns, then maybe you can understand the fundamental principles governing all of reality. It's ambitious, perhaps overly so, but ambition is what separates philosophers from people who just accept that things are the way they are. The path he's walking is familiar, a route he's taken hundreds of times between his home and the agora, where he often teaches or debates. It winds through residential areas, past workshops and storage buildings, along walls and through narrow passages. During the daytime, it's perfectly safe and easy to navigate. At night, lit only by moonlight and the occasional lamp, it requires more attention than Thales is currently providing. There's a well along this path, one of many that dot the city. It's not particularly large or deep, just a standard well for drawing water, with a low wall around its opening. During daylight hours, the wall is visible enough that avoiding it requires no special effort. At night, with your attention focused entirely on the sky, it becomes what safety inspectors would call a hazard, if safety inspectors existed, which they don't. Thales is mid-calculation, working out something about star positions and angular measurements, when his foot finds not the packed earth of the path, but the empty air beyond the well's edge. There's a moment, probably very brief though it might have felt longer, where he realizes something has gone terribly wrong with his relationship to the ground. And then he's falling. Not far, wells aren't bottomless pits, but far enough to be undignified and potentially dangerous. He hits water with a splash that probably echoes off the well walls, creating a sound that carries through the quiet evening. The water isn't deep enough to drown in, assuming he doesn't panic, but it's deep enough to be cold, shocking, and thoroughly soaking. For a moment, there's just confusion. The brilliant philosopher, the man who predicted eclipses and proposed theories about the fundamental nature of reality, is standing waist-deep in well water, dripping, probably bruised from the fall, certainly surprised. The stars he was studying so intently are now visible only as a circle of light far above, framed by the well's opening. The cosmic irony is immediate and perfect. The man trying to understand the heavens has fallen into the earth. The philosopher who thinks about distant celestial mechanics forgot about immediate terrestrial geography. It's the kind of moment that defines a person's reputation, not because it's important, but because it's too perfectly symbolic to forget. Thales starts trying to climb out, which is more difficult than you'd think. Wells are designed to keep water in, not to facilitate easy climbing by soaked philosophers. The walls are slippery, his clothes are heavy with water, and there's nothing obvious to grab onto. He's in reasonably good shape for his age, but he's not young, and climbing out of wells wasn't part of his usual exercise routine. His calls for help echo off the walls, bouncing around before reaching the surface. Someone hears, eventually. The sources say it's a Thracian servant girl, though whether that's historically accurate or just a detail added later for narrative flavor is impossible to know. Whoever it is, they look down into the well and see the famous philosopher Thales, soaking wet and stuck. And then comes the line that survives for over 2,000 years, the quote that gets repeated in philosophy texts and comedy routines across centuries. How can you expect to understand the heavens, Thales, when you can't even see what's at your feet? It's a perfect burn, the kind of observation that's simultaneously helpful and devastating. The servant is probably going to get him out, but not before making sure he understands exactly how ridiculous this situation is. Philosophy may be important, but watching where you're walking is practical, and practical matters tend to win arguments when one party is in a well and the other isn't. Help arrives eventually. Ropes, probably, or maybe a ladder. The details aren't preserved because ancient historians were more interested in the philosophical implications than the rescue logistics. Thales is extracted from the well, dripping and embarrassed, his dignity considerably more damaged than his body. The story spreads immediately, because of course it does. Miletus is a city, but not a huge one, and a famous philosopher falling in a well is exactly the kind of gossip that travels fast. By the next morning, everyone knows. By the next week, people in neighboring cities have heard. Within months, it's becoming one of those stories that defines Greek philosophy's relationship with practical reality. But let's back up and understand who Thales actually is, beyond the well-falling incident. He's considered by many to be the first philosopher in the Western tradition, the first person to ask fundamental questions about reality without immediately attributing everything to gods and myths. This is a bigger deal than it sounds. Before Thales and his contemporaries, explanations for natural phenomena were mythological. Thunder happens because Zeus is angry. Crops fail because Demeter is sad. The sun moves across the sky because Helios drives his chariot. These stories work as explanations if you don't look too closely, providing comforting narratives that make the world feel comprehensible. Thales looks closely. He asks, what if there are natural explanations? What if we can understand why things happen without invoking divine intervention? What if the universe operates according to principles we can discover and understand? These questions seem obvious now, but in 600 BCE, they're revolutionary. His most famous philosophical proposal is that water is the fundamental substance, the arche, the origin from which everything else derives. It seems strange to modern ears, but consider what Thales observes. Water is everywhere, in the sea, in rain, in rivers, in living things. It changes form, becoming ice or steam. It's essential for life. Seeds need water to grow. Bodies need water to function. Maybe, Thales reasons, everything is ultimately water in different configurations. Earth could be condensed water. Air could be water vapor. Fire could be water transformed by some process we don't yet understand. It's wrong, obviously, but it's wrong in an interesting way. It's an attempt at a unified theory, a single principle explaining everything. More importantly, it's testable. Not easily, not with Bronze Age technology, but in principle, you could investigate whether things are made of water. You can't really test whether Zeus controls thunder. Thales' water theory is philosophy, but it's also proto-science, an early attempt at naturalistic explanation. His work in astronomy is similarly groundbreaking. The solar eclipse he supposedly predicted in 585 BCE, whether through calculation or luck, demonstrates that celestial events follow patterns. They're not random acts of divine will, but predictable phenomena governed by consistent principles. This is huge. This transforms the heavens from mysterious and arbitrary to comprehensible and orderly. He also claims, according to later sources, that the Earth floats on water, which is wrong, but again, interestingly wrong. He's trying to solve a real problem. What holds the Earth up? The mythological answer is that Atlas holds it, or it sits on a giant turtle, or whatever. Thales proposes a natural mechanism. The mechanism is incorrect, but the approach is sound. In mathematics, Thales is credited with several theorems, though whether he actually proved them formally or just noticed they were true is debated. The theorem that a circle is bisected by its diameter seems obvious, but someone had to be first to state it explicitly. The theorem about angles in a triangle inscribed in a semicircle is more sophisticated and genuinely useful for navigation and surveying. He supposedly used geometry to measure the height of pyramids in Egypt, calculating their height by measuring their shadow at the time of day when his shadow equaled his height. It's elegant and shows practical application of mathematical principles. Whether this story is true or apocryphal doesn't really matter. It illustrates the kind of thinking Thales exemplifies. His business acumen occasionally surfaces in the stories about him. One famous anecdote tells of Thales predicting a good olive harvest and renting all the olive presses in advance, then making a fortune when the harvest came and everyone needed to press olives. The point of the story is that philosophers could be wealthy if they wanted, but they're interested in wisdom rather than money. This might be true, or it might be a story invented later to defend philosophy against charges of uselessness. Either way, it presents Thales as someone who understands practical matters but chooses to focus on theoretical questions, which makes the well incident even more ironic. He can corner the olive press market but can't avoid an obvious hole in the ground. The Thracian servant's rebuke becomes philosophically important beyond the immediate situation. It raises a genuine question about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. Is it better to understand celestial mechanics or to watch where you're walking? The obvious answer is both, but philosophy often involves trade-offs between different types of knowledge. Later philosophers reference this incident when discussing the nature of wisdom. Plato mentions it in his dialogue Theaetetus, using it to explore tensions between philosophical contemplation and everyday life. Aristotle refers to it when discussing practical versus theoretical wisdom. The story becomes canonical, a parable about philosophy's relationship with the world. Some interpret it as criticism of philosophy, suggesting that abstract thinking is useless if it makes you unable to function in basic ways. Others see it as defense of philosophy, arguing that true wisdom requires occasional inattention to mundane matters. The servant girl's mockery can be read as either practical wisdom or short-sighted pragmatism, depending on your philosophical commitments. Thales probably takes the ribbing with reasonable grace. He's lived long enough to know that dignity is less important than learning, and there's definitely a lesson here, even if it's not the profound philosophical insight he usually seeks. Sometimes the immediate environment matters more than distant speculation. The well itself becomes part of Milesian local culture, probably. If tourists existed in 580 BCE, they'd want to see the famous well where Thales fell. Locals probably pointed out to visitors, and this is where our most famous philosopher proved that intelligence and common sense aren't the same thing. Thales continues his work after the incident, presumably while watching where he walks more carefully. His influence on subsequent philosophy is enormous. He's credited as the founder of the Milesian school, a tradition of naturalistic inquiry that includes his students Anaximander and Anaximenes. Together, they transform how Greeks think about the natural world. Anaximander, Thales' student, proposes that the fundamental substance isn't water, but something he calls the apeiron, the boundless or unlimited. It's more abstract than Thales' water, showing how philosophy evolves through student-teacher dialogue. Anaximenes, in turn, proposes air as the fundamental substance, creating a pattern of disagreement and refinement that characterizes Greek philosophy. The Milesian approach to philosophy emphasizes observation and reason over myth and tradition. They're not perfect empiricists. They often speculate far beyond their evidence. but they establish the principle that natural phenomena have natural explanations discoverable through human reason. This is the beginning of science, even if it doesn't look much like modern science yet. Thales' mathematical work influences Greek geometry profoundly. His theorems, even the simple ones, establish that geometric relationships can be proven rather than just assumed. This leads eventually to Euclid's systematic treatment of geometry, which dominates mathematics for over 2,000 years. His astronomical work, accurate or not, encourages others to study the heavens systematically. The idea that celestial events are predictable rather than arbitrary opens up astronomy as a field of study. Later Greek astronomers build increasingly sophisticated models of planetary motion, all starting from the basic insight that the heavens follow rules. The Seven Sages tradition, of which Thales is part, represents an early attempt to codify wisdom. These aren't philosophers in the later technical sense, but practical wise men whose sayings and actions exemplify good judgment. Thales' inclusion in this group shows he's respected not just as a thinker, but as someone with practical wisdom, well, incident notwithstanding. The other sages include figures like Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, and Pittacus, the ruler of Mytilene. Their advice tends toward practical maxims: nothing in excess, know thyself, surety brings ruin. These aren't deep philosophical principles, but useful life advice, the kind of thing that actually helps people navigate social reality. Thales' contribution to this wisdom tradition is interesting, because his philosophical work is more abstract than the typical sage material. He's thinking about fundamental substances and celestial mechanics, while his fellow sages are giving advice about moderation and self-knowledge. The well incident brings him back down to their level, literally and figuratively. The relationship between Thales and his home city Miletus is mutually beneficial. Miletus is wealthy from trade, which provides leisure for philosophical speculation. Thales and his students make Miletus famous as an intellectual center, attracting other thinkers and enhancing the city's prestige. It's an early example of how cities benefit from supporting intellectual work. The political context matters too. Miletus in Thales' time is independent but aware of larger powers. The Lydian kingdom to the east, the Persian Empire beyond that, and other Greek cities all represent potential threats or opportunities. Thales reportedly serves as an advisor on political matters, using his reputation for wisdom to influence policy decisions. One story has him advising the Ionian cities to form a federation for mutual defense, anticipating centuries the kind of political thinking that later creates leagues and alliances. Whether he actually gave this advice or whether it's retroactively attributed to make him seem prescient, it shows how his reputation extended beyond pure philosophy. The cosmopolitan nature of Miletus influences Thales' thinking. The city's position as a trade hub means exposure to Egyptian, Babylonian, and other Near Eastern ideas. Thales may have traveled to Egypt, may have learned from Babylonian astronomy, may have absorbed mathematical techniques from various traditions and synthesized them into something new. Greek philosophy doesn't arise in isolation. It emerges from a Mediterranean world where ideas travel along trade routes, where scholars from different cultures exchange knowledge, where practical skills from engineering and navigation create problems that demand theoretical solutions. Thales is product and producer of this intellectual ferment. His religious views are difficult to pin down from the surviving evidence. He says, "All things are full of gods," which sounds pious, but might mean something like, "All things have inherent properties," or "Nature itself is divine." He's not an atheist, That concept barely exists yet, but he's pushing toward naturalistic explanation in ways that reduce the explanatory role of traditional gods. This creates tension between philosophy and religion that persists throughout ancient history. Philosophers keep proposing natural explanations that make divine intervention unnecessary, while traditional religion insists on divine causation. Thales doesn't resolve this tension, he just inaugurates it, setting up debates that continue for centuries. The fragment about magnetism attributed to Thales, that magnets have souls because they move iron, shows how he tries to explain observed phenomena. He sees movement and infers some kind of animating principle, which is wrong, but not unreasonable given his conceptual framework. It's better than saying magic and leaving it at that. His influence on Plato is indirect but real. Plato's early dialogues feature Socrates asking fundamental questions about justice, virtue, knowledge, the same impulse toward foundational inquiry that drives Thales and the Milesians who dared to think systematically about reality. Aristotle explicitly acknowledges Thales as the first philosopher, the originator of the tradition Aristotle himself inherits. When Aristotle systematizes philosophy into different branches, metaphysics, physics, ethics, politics, he's building on groundwork laid by Thales and the Milesians who dared to think systematically about reality. The question of what Thales actually wrote, if anything, haunts scholarship. No writings survive, only references in later sources. Did he write nothing, conveying his ideas orally? Did he write things that got lost? Do we have his ideas filtered through multiple layers of interpretation and embellishment? This is a problem for all pre-Socratic philosophers. We have fragments, quotes, summaries, but rarely complete works. Understanding Thales means reconstructing ideas from scattered references, which inevitably involves speculation and interpretation. The well story might be the most reliably transmitted piece of information about him, preserved because it's funny, rather than because it's philosophically important. In his old age, Thales presumably reflects on his life's work with satisfaction. He's transformed how people think about the natural world, established new methods of inquiry, solved practical problems with mathematical techniques, and become famous enough that people remember him centuries later. The well incident is embarrassing, but hardly defines his legacy. Or maybe he thinks more about the well than we'd expect. Maybe that moment of falling, of sudden unexpected descent while focused elsewhere, becomes metaphorically important. Philosophy is full of moments like that, where you think you understand something and then discover you've missed something crucial. The ground disappears, the certainties fail, and you're suddenly somewhere unexpected. The Thracian servant's mockery might sting less over time and reveal more. She wasn't wrong. Understanding the heavens is impressive, but it doesn't excuse ignoring immediate reality. Complete wisdom requires attention to both distant principles and nearby obstacles, theoretical insights and practical necessities. Thales dies eventually, as even philosophers must. The exact date is uncertain. Somewhere around 546 BCE, according to ancient chronologies that may or may not be accurate. He lives to a respectably old age by ancient standards, dying peacefully rather than dramatically, which is probably what he would have wanted. His influence doesn't die with him. The Milesian school continues under his students. Other philosophers build on his foundation, agreeing or disagreeing, but always engaging with the project he started. The tradition of naturalistic inquiry, of asking fundamental questions about reality, of seeking explanations through reason rather than myth, all this flows from Thales and his contemporaries. The well story becomes part of philosophical folklore, told and retold whenever people discuss the relationship between theory and practice. It appears in jest books, philosophical dialogues, histories, commentaries. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects, but the core remains: the wise man who looked up and fell down. The medieval philosophers reference it when discussing contemplation versus action. Renaissance thinkers use it to defend or critique various approaches to knowledge. Enlightenment philosophers drag it out again to talk about reason and experience. The story has legs, carrying meaning across vast stretches of time and culture. Modern scientists and philosophers still find it relevant. The absent-minded professor, brilliant about abstract matters but helpless with practical ones, descends directly from Thales and his well. Every time someone makes a joke about academics being out of touch with reality, they're echoing that Thracian servant's rebuke. But there's another reading, more sympathetic to Thales. Maybe falling in the well is the price of looking at the stars. Maybe you can't do both perfectly, watch the ground and study the heavens, and Thales made a choice about what deserved his attention. Most people never fall in wells because they never look up. They're safe but uncurious, practical but unaware of the larger cosmos they inhabit. Thales fell because he was reaching for something beyond everyday concerns. That's not stupidity, it's ambition. It's the impulse to understand rather than just survive, to question rather than just accept. And yes, sometimes that means missing obvious hazards, but the alternative is a life spent watching your feet, never seeing the stars. The well itself, if it still existed in Thales' time for long afterward, probably became a tourist attraction of sorts. People would point it out, tell the story, laugh at the philosopher's misfortune, while secretly admiring his dedication. Wells need water, but they also need stories, and this one has a better story than most. In the quiet hours after rescue, dripping and bruised, Thales might have looked up at the circle of stars visible from the well's bottom and thought about perspective. From down here, the visible sky is bounded, limited to what fits through the opening. But the stars visible in that small circle are the same stars visible from everywhere, following the same patterns, governed by the same principles. Maybe that's when he understood something about viewpoint and knowledge. You can see truth from anywhere, even the bottom of a well, if you know how to look and what to look for. The circumstances of observation don't change the reality observed. Water is water, whether you're studying it theoretically or sitting in it literally. Or maybe he just thought, this is really cold and I want to get out. Because philosophers are human beings, before they're philosophers, subject to discomfort and embarrassment like everyone else. The Milesian school's emphasis on natural explanation extends to human experience. We're part of nature too, subject to the same forces, the same principles of cause and effect. When Thales climbs out of the well, wet and chastened, he returns to a world where people will remember this incident forever. His eclipse prediction, his mathematical theorems, his philosophical proposals about water and substance, all important, all influential, but none as memorable as the time he fell in a hole while stargazing. There's a lesson here about how history remembers people. The significant achievements matter. They shape subsequent thought and practice. But the human moments, the embarrassing incidents, the perfectly ironic failures, these are what people remember and retell. Thales the philosopher influences intellectual history. Thales in the well influences popular culture. Both matter. The serious work he does advances human understanding genuinely and permanently. The comic incident makes him relatable, human, approachable, across the vast distance of centuries. We can't really relate to someone who predicts eclipses, but we can relate to someone who trips over obvious obstacles while distracted. That's universal. The stars Thales was watching that night are still there, still following the same patterns. The well is long gone, filled in or destroyed or simply abandoned when Miletus declined. The city itself is ruins now, barely recognizable, its harbors silted up, its glories dust. But the story survives, fresher than the marble, more durable than bronze. That's the paradox of philosophy. The immediate moment seems trivial compared to eternal truths, but the immediate moment is what we remember. The eternal truths matter. They structure everything that comes after, but they're abstract, hard to grasp, easily forgotten. A philosopher falling in a well? That's concrete, specific, memorable. Maybe this is what the Thracian servant understood better than Thales. The heavens are important, sure, but the ground matters more, because it's where we live, where we stumble, where we pick ourselves up and continue. Philosophy can contemplate the eternal, but it happens in time, in places, to particular people, with wet clothes and bruised dignity. As evening settles over Miletus, night after night, people walk past wells without incident, watch their feet, reach their destinations safely. They're not fools for this. They're sensible. But somewhere, occasionally, someone looks up instead of down, sees something amazing in the heavens, and takes one step too many without watching where it lands. That's when philosophy happens. That's when humanity reaches beyond itself, willing to risk the fall for the chance of understanding. Thales, in his well, wet and embarrassed, but still thinking about stars, represents something essential about human curiosity. We look up even when it would be safer to look down. And maybe, just maybe, the well was worth it. Not for Thales personally, who probably would have preferred to stay dry, but for philosophy itself. The story becomes a teaching tool, a reminder that wisdom requires balance, that no insight is complete if it blinds you to immediate reality. Every philosopher after Thales knows about the well, and every philosopher has to decide how to avoid making the same mistake. The balance between abstract thought and practical awareness becomes a central problem in philosophy. How do you think deeply about fundamental questions without losing touch with everyday reality? How do you maintain both perspectives simultaneously? Thales doesn't solve this problem, but he makes it visible, concrete, impossible to ignore. Later philosophers develop different strategies. Some, like the Stoics, try to integrate practical wisdom with theoretical understanding, arguing that true philosophy makes you better at living, not worse. Others, like the Cynics, reject abstract speculation entirely, focusing on practical virtue and natural living. Still others, like Plato, defend pure contemplation as the highest activity, accepting that philosophers might be impractical. Each approach is partly a response to Thales as well. The incident poses a question that philosophy must answer. What's the relationship between thinking and doing, between theory and practice, between understanding the world and navigating it successfully? Different schools answer differently, but they all recognize the question's importance. The medieval period loves the Thales story because it fits their concerns about contemplative versus active life. Monks and scholars debate whether pure contemplation of divine truth is better than active service in the world. Thales becomes an example in these debates, though it's not clear which side he supports. Is he a warning against excessive contemplation, or proof that contemplation is valuable despite its risks? The Renaissance humanists use the story differently, emphasizing the unity of theory and practice they claim characterized ancient wisdom. The ideal Renaissance man is supposed to be both philosopher and engineer, thinker and doer, someone who understands celestial mechanics and also watches where he walks. They see Thales's error as correctable, not inevitable. Enlightenment philosophers bring the story out again when debating the relationship between reason and experience. Rationalists might see Thales as properly focused on rational principles, even if experience sometimes intrudes painfully. Empiricists might use the well as evidence that pure reason without attention to experience leads to disaster. Modern academia still struggles with the same tension. Scholars who know everything about their specialized fields but can't manage basic life tasks are a stereotype because they're common enough to recognize. The absent-minded professor jokes all descend from Thales, still falling into metaphorical wells while thinking about complex abstractions. But modern science has also vindicated Thales's approach in crucial ways. His insistence that natural phenomena have natural explanations, his attempt to find unified principles underlying diverse observations, his mathematical approach to problems, all this is fundamentally scientific. We know now that he was wrong about water being a fundamental substance, but he was right about the project of finding fundamental substances. The stars Thales watched are still there, and we understand them better now because people like him looked up and asked questions. Yes, he fell in a well, but his intellectual descendants went to the moon, split the atom, mapped the human genome, and revealed the universe's structure across billions of light years. That's the legacy of looking up instead of down. The immediate practical wisdom, watch your feet, avoid wells, remains important. You can't do science or philosophy if you're dead from preventable accidents. Basic survival skills matter, but survival alone isn't enough. Humans don't just survive, they question, wonder, seek understanding beyond what's necessary for mere existence. Thales in his well represents that drive to understand, even at the cost of comfort or safety. The Thracian servant represents the practical wisdom that keeps us alive enough to indulge our curiosity. Both are necessary, neither is sufficient alone. The complete person, the complete culture, needs both perspectives working together. As the years pass in Miletus after the well incident, life continues its rhythm. Ships come and go in the harbor, bringing goods and ideas from across the Mediterranean. Markets bustle with commerce. Craftsmen practice their trades. Families raise children. Politicians scheme and debate. And philosophers Thales and his students continue asking difficult questions about reality, being, and nature. The well story gets funnier with each retelling, details embellished, the servant's rebuke sharpened, Thales' embarrassment enhanced for comic effect. But underneath the comedy, there's genuine respect. Miletus is proud of its philosophers, proud that their city produces people who think about fundamental questions. Even the jokes contain admiration. Other cities have their claims to fame. Athens will later dominate philosophy with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Sparta is famous for military prowess, Corinth for commerce. But Miletus, right now, is where philosophy begins, where human beings first systematically attempt to understand nature through reason and observation rather than myth and tradition. Thales' house probably becomes a gathering place for intellectually curious people. Students come to learn, travelers stop to debate, locals drop by to ask questions or just listen. It's informal, nothing like later philosophical schools with their structured curricula, but it's the beginning of an institution that will shape Western thought for millennia. The discussions that happen there range across everything: mathematics, astronomy, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics. No topic is off limits when you're inventing philosophy from scratch. Some ideas are brilliant, others absurd, many somewhere in between. But all contribute to a growing body of thought about how to understand the world systematically. Thales probably tells the well story himself eventually, once enough time passes that it's funny rather than mortifying. He's wise enough to laugh at himself, to recognize that even philosophers make ridiculous mistakes. The story becomes part of his teaching, an illustration of principles he wants students to grasp: balance, humility, attention to multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Students learn not just from his theories, but from his mistakes. The well teaches more clearly than any lecture about fundamental substances. It's concrete, memorable, and applicable to their own lives. They might never need to know about water as archy, but they'll definitely need to watch where they walk while thinking about complex problems. The generations after Thales continue his work, building on his foundation. Philosophy becomes more sophisticated, more systematic, more aware of its own methods and limitations. But it never completely escapes the tension Thales embodied, the pull between abstract understanding and concrete existence, between thinking about life and actually living it. Every philosopher falls into their own version of the well at some point. Maybe literally, probably metaphorically. You become so focused on one aspect of reality that you miss another, so absorbed in your theoretical framework that practical considerations blindside you. It's occupational hazard. The question is whether you learn from the experience or just climb out and immediately start staring at the stars again. Thales probably learned. He was wise enough to recognize wisdom when he heard it, even from a Thracian servant, even when it came in the form of mockery. The ability to accept criticism, to adjust behavior based on feedback, to remain teachable even when you're the teacher, these are marks of genuine wisdom rather than mere intelligence. As evening settles over Miletus on countless nights after the incident, Thales probably still looks at the stars. He can't help it. They're fascinating. They follow patterns. They pose questions that demand answers. But he probably also watches his path more carefully, checks the ground occasionally, maintains awareness of his immediate environment while contemplating distant phenomena. The well taught him multitasking. And slowly, as he ages and his time grows shorter, Thales might reflect on what he's accomplished. Not just the specific discoveries or theories, though those matter, but the broader legacy. He's shown that human reason can investigate nature systematically, that questions can be asked without fear of impiety, that understanding is possible even when traditional answers seem inadequate. This is no small thing. Before Thales and his contemporaries, knowledge was largely received tradition, handed down from ancestors, sanctified by age and authority. Questioning was dangerous, innovation suspect. Thales helps create intellectual space where questioning becomes legitimate, where innovation is valued, where understanding matters more than conformity. The well incident doesn't diminish this achievement, it humanizes it. Thales isn't a mythological figure or semi-divine sage. He's a person, flawed and fallible, capable of both brilliance and stupidity, sometimes within minutes of each other. That makes his accomplishments more impressive, not less. He achieved insight despite being human, or perhaps because of it. And now, we will move to our next story. All right, guys, now we continue with the other part, Diogenes and the Lantern. If you thought Thales staring at the sky was eccentric, buckle up, because we're about to meet a philosopher who lived in a barrel, insulted Alexander the Great to his face, and spent his afternoons wandering around Athens with a lamp in broad daylight, looking for something he claimed didn't exist. Welcome to the story of history's most aggressively unbothered man. Diogenes of Sinope, born around 412 BCE, was not your typical Greek philosopher. While other philosophers wore nice robes and debated in fancy academies, Diogenes decided that owning stuff was overrated and civilization was basically a scam. So he gave away everything he owned, moved into a large ceramic wine jar in the marketplace, and dedicated his life to proving that humans had gotten way too complicated about the simple business of existing. Now, to understand why Diogenes ended up walking around with a lantern in the middle of the day, we need to back up and talk about how he got to Athens in the first place. Diogenes came from Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea coast where his father was a banker. And here's where the story gets interesting, because Diogenes didn't leave home to pursue philosophy. He left because he and his dad got caught defacing the currency. Yes, you heard that right. Before he was a famous philosopher, Diogenes was essentially a counterfeiter. He and his father were stamping fake coins or shaving precious metal off real ones, depending on which ancient source you believe. They got caught, Diogenes got exiled, and he decided that since he'd been kicked out for messing with money, maybe money was the problem to begin with. So he arrived in Athens, probably around 355 BCE, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing conviction that most of what people worried about was completely pointless. Athens at this time was the intellectual center of the Greek world. Plato was teaching at his academy, Aristotle would soon be tutoring Alexander, and everyone who was anyone in philosophy was hanging around debating the nature of reality, virtue, and the ideal state. Diogenes looked at all this intellectual activity and basically said, "You're all missing the point." While Plato was constructing elaborate theories about ideal forms existing in some perfect realm beyond our perception, Diogenes was more interested in the immediate, practical question of how to actually live. And his answer was radical. Live like a dog. This is where he got the name cynic, from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like. And Diogenes took this literally. Dogs don't worry about status, don't accumulate possessions, don't care about social conventions, and they're perfectly content with the basics: food, water, shelter, and maybe someone to scratch behind their ears occasionally. So Diogenes found himself a pithos, which is a large ceramic storage jar, the kind Greeks used to store wine or grain. He moved it to the Athenian agora, right in the center of public life, and made it his home. Not as a temporary measure until he found proper housing, but as a permanent lifestyle choice. This wasn't a barrel in the sense of wooden staves held together with iron bands. It was a huge clay jar, probably about 4 feet tall, lying on its side. Imagine the scene. The agora was the bustling heart of Athens, filled with merchants, politicians, shoppers, gossips, and philosophers. And right there, in the middle of all this activity, was a scruffy guy living in a jar, owning literally nothing except maybe a cloak, a walking stick, and eventually that famous lantern. The jar living wasn't just eccentricity for its own sake. Diogenes was making a point. Every single day, just by existing in his jar, he was demonstrating that humans don't actually need most of the things they think they need. No house, no furniture, no kitchen, no wardrobe full of different outfits for different occasions. Just a jar to keep the rain off and maybe provide some shade from the Mediterranean sun. He ate whatever food people gave him, or whatever he could bag or scavenge. He drank water from his hands, having thrown away his cup after seeing a child drink from cupped palms and realizing even a cup was an unnecessary luxury. He had one cloak that served as clothing during the day and a blanket at night. When it wore out, he'd get another one, probably donated by someone who felt sorry for him, not realizing that Diogenes didn't want their pity.
Now, living in a jar in the marketplace meant Diogenes had a front row seat to all of Athenian life, and what he saw apparently did not impress him. He watched merchants haggling over prices for things nobody really needed. He saw politicians giving flowery speeches about virtue while taking bribes. He observed philosophers teaching students about self-control while living in luxury. And he saw ordinary people worrying themselves sick about social status, money, reputation, and all the other things that seemed to him like complete distractions from actually living. This is the context in which the lantern incident happened. Diogenes had been living in Athens for a while, establishing his reputation as the guy who said whatever he thought with zero filter, who had no respect for social rank or conventional propriety, and who seemed genuinely unbothered by things that would mortify normal people. One afternoon, in broad daylight, with the Mediterranean sun blazing down on the agora, Diogenes lit his lantern. Not the kind of lantern we think of today, but an ancient oil lamp, probably clay, with a small flame burning olive oil. And he started walking through the crowded marketplace, holding this lit lamp up to people's faces, peering at them intently, and moving on to the next person. Now picture the scene. It's the middle of the day, the sun is shining, visibility is perfect, and here's this ragged philosopher living in a jar, walking around with a tiny flickering lamp, holding it up like he's searching for something in the dark. People started gathering around, amused, curious, or annoyed, depending on their personality. Someone finally asked the obvious question, "Diogenes, what are you doing?" And Diogenes, without missing a beat, said, "I'm looking for an honest man." Then he'd peer at whoever asked a question, shake his head, and move on to the next person, as if to say, "Not you either." Now, this wasn't just a random stunt. Diogenes was making several points simultaneously, which is what made him such an effective philosophical provocateur. First, he was pointing out that honesty had become so rare in Athens that you'd need artificial light to find it, even in broad daylight. The implication being that dishonesty was so pervasive it had created a kind of moral darkness that no amount of sunshine could penetrate. Second, he was mocking the entire Athenian population all at once.
By walking through the marketplace, the most public space in the city, and examining people one by one with his lantern, he was essentially conducting a satirical census of corruption. Merchant? Dishonest. Politician? Dishonest. Philosopher? Also dishonest. Rich man? Poor man? Middle-class craftsman? All failing the honesty test. Third, and this is the most subtle part, he was critiquing the entire philosophical project of his contemporaries. Plato and his followers were busy constructing elaborate theories about ideal forms and perfect justice, but Diogenes was saying essentially, how about we start with something basic, like finding one genuinely honest person? Because if we can't even manage that, what's the point of all your fancy theories? The lantern search became one of Diogenes' most famous acts, but it wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a whole career of public philosophy performed through absurd, provocative gestures. This was a man who, when Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, and everyone praised this definition as clever, plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy, announcing, "Behold, I have brought you a man." Plato had to revise his definition to a featherless biped with broad, flat nails. And Diogenes had made his point. Fancy definitions don't capture reality. They just create loopholes. This was his approach to philosophy. Don't just argue in the abstract. Demonstrate your point in a way that's impossible to ignore or dismiss. The lantern incident worked the same way. He could have written a treatise on the decline of honesty in Athenian society. He could have given lectures about moral corruption. Instead, he walked around with a lamp in broad daylight, and everyone got the point immediately. It was philosophical street theater, and it was devastatingly effective. What made it even more cutting was that Diogenes never found what he was looking for. He didn't stop his search, examine someone closely, and announce, "Ah, here's an honest man." That would have undercut his point. Instead, he continued looking day after day, the perpetual search implying that honest people had become essentially mythical creatures in Athens, like unicorns or perfectly virtuous philosopher kings. Now, you might wonder why the Athenians put up with this. Why didn't they just ignore him or run him out of town? The answer is complicated. First, Athens prided itself on being open to free speech and philosophical inquiry, even when that inquiry was insulting. Second, Diogenes was genuinely entertaining. Yes, he was criticizing everyone, but he was doing it in such creative, outrageous ways that people couldn't help but watch. Third, and this is important, Diogenes lived what he preached. He wasn't like modern critics who complain about consumerism from their expensive apartments. He actually lived in a jar with no possessions. He wasn't a hypocrite, which made his criticism harder to dismiss. You couldn't say, "Easy for you to criticize wealth and comfort," because he genuinely rejected both and seemed perfectly content with his choice. The lantern also became a kind of trademark for Diogenes. People started associating him with that image, the philosopher with the lamp, searching for honesty in a dishonest world. It was simple, memorable, and packed with meaning. Even people who'd never met Diogenes heard about the lantern guy and understood immediately what he represented. But let's dig deeper into what Diogenes meant by honest. He wasn't just talking about people not telling lies, though that was part of it. He meant something more fundamental, being honest about what you really are versus what you pretend to be. The Greeks had a concept called parousia, which means fearless speech or frank honesty, saying what you actually think without sugarcoating it to please your audience. Diogenes practiced parousia constantly, and he was looking for others who did the same. But everywhere he looked, he saw people wearing masks, rich people pretending their wealth came from virtue rather than luck or exploitation,
Poor people pretending they'd be generous if only they had money. Politicians claiming to serve the public good while enriching themselves. Philosophers teaching ethics while living in luxury and accepting gifts from tyrants. The marketplace where Diogenes conducted his lamp search was particularly appropriate because it was where all these hypocrisies intersected. It was where economic transactions happened, where cheating and honest dealing met. It was where politicians gave speeches, where philosophers taught students, where gossip spread, where reputations were made and destroyed. The Agora was Athens in miniature, and by searching there, Diogenes was examining the city's soul. His methodology was brilliantly simple. Just walk up to people and look at them closely, as if examining them for authenticity, like you'd examine a coin for counterfeits, which, given his history with currency defacement, was probably intentional irony. He had been exiled for making fake coins, and now he was pointing out that the whole city was full of fake people, counterfeit humans who looked genuine from a distance but couldn't withstand close inspection. The lantern itself was probably an old, cheap clay oil lamp, nothing fancy. Diogenes wouldn't have used an expensive lamp because that would contradict his whole philosophy of rejecting luxury. It would have been simple, functional, the kind of lamp a poor person might use. The ordinariness of the lamp made the gesture even more pointed. He wasn't using some special magical truth-detecting device. He was using an everyday object in an absurd context to make everyone think about honesty.
The time of day mattered too. Doing this at night would have made practical sense. You need light in the dark. But Diogenes did it in broad daylight, when the lamp was obviously unnecessary for physical visibility. This highlighted that he was talking about a different kind of darkness and a different kind of light. The darkness of moral corruption and the light of truth and self-examination. As Diogenes walked through the marketplace, holding his lantern up to merchant faces, they probably laughed nervously or got annoyed. When he approached politicians, they might have tried to ignore him or made jokes to defuse the situation. When he examined wealthy citizens, they probably felt insulted that this homeless, jar-dwelling philosopher dared to judge them. And when he looked at fellow philosophers, they probably got defensive and tried to out-clever him with arguments about why his gesture was philosophically naive. But none of these reactions mattered to Diogenes. He wasn't trying to win debates or make friends. He was holding up a mirror to society, and the fact that people got uncomfortable proved his point. If they were genuinely honest, they wouldn't mind being examined. The discomfort revealed the gap between their public persona and private reality. This brings us to probably the most famous story about Diogenes, which happened around the same time as his lantern search and shows his absolute fearlessness in the face of power. Alexander the Great, arguably the most powerful person in the world, heard about this eccentric philosopher living in a jar and decided to visit him. Alexander found Diogenes lounging in or near his jar, probably sunbathing, completely unbothered by the arrival of an army and the most powerful military commander in human history. Alexander, who was used to people bowing and scraping, introduced himself and asked if there was anything he could do for Diogenes, any favor he could grant. Diogenes looked up at Alexander, who was presumably standing in a way that blocked the sun, and said, "Yes, step aside, you're blocking my light." That's it. No flattery, no requests for money or position, no attempt to use this connection for personal advantage, just move, you're in my sun. Alexander's companions were probably shocked, expecting the king to have Diogenes executed for disrespect. But Alexander, to his credit, was impressed. He reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." He recognized that Diogenes possessed something Alexander, despite all his power and wealth, didn't have: complete freedom from wanting anything,
complete indifference to social status and power. This story connects directly to the lantern search because it demonstrates what Diogenes meant by honesty. Diogenes was completely honest about what he wanted, which was nothing except sunlight. He didn't pretend to admire Alexander to gain favor. He didn't fake humility or exaggerate his poverty to elicit sympathy. He just was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who'd concluded that wanting less made you freer than having more. When Diogenes held up his lantern and examined people's faces, he was looking for that kind of radical authenticity. Someone who was exactly what they appeared to be, with no gap between their public face and private self. Someone who didn't adjust their behavior based on who was watching. Someone who genuinely meant what they said and said what they meant. And he never found it. Or rather, the joke is that maybe he did find one honest person, himself, living in his jar, owning nothing, saying exactly what he thought, performing his philosophy through his daily existence rather than just talking about it. Maybe the lantern search was an elaborate setup for Diogenes to be the punchline of his own joke. The philosophical school that developed from Diogenes' teaching, Cynicism, took these ideas and ran with them. The Cynics believed that virtue was the only good, that it was completely sufficient for happiness, and that it was demonstrated through action, not words. They rejected all conventional desires for wealth, power, fame, and family, arguing that these attachments made you vulnerable and unfree. Diogenes demonstrated this philosophy constantly. He ate in the marketplace, which was considered rude because eating was supposed to be a private, domestic activity. When people criticized him, he pointed out that if eating is natural and necessary, why should he be ashamed to do it in public? He performed other bodily functions publicly too, which ancient sources mention, but which we don't need to detail. His point was always the same. These are natural, universal human needs, so why pretend they don't exist? He deliberately violated social conventions to show they were arbitrary. He walked backwards through the marketplace, and when people asked why, he said it was because society was going in the wrong direction, so walking backwards was actually moving forward. He entered theaters when crowds were leaving, and left when they were entering, demonstrating that he deliberately went against the flow of conventional behavior. The lantern search fits perfectly into this pattern. It's a violation of normal behavior, using a lamp when you don't need one, examining strangers uninvited, making a public spectacle of yourself, and refusing to explain or justify your actions in conventional terms. But unlike random weirdness, it had a clear philosophical point that people understood immediately. What's remarkable is how these ancient stories still resonate. The image of someone walking around with a lamp looking for an honest person is still used today, over 2,000 years later, whenever someone wants to express frustration with widespread dishonesty or corruption. Diogenes created a meme that survived millennia without the internet. Part of why it endures is because the problem Diogenes identified hasn't gone away. People still wear masks, still present carefully curated versions of themselves, still say things they don't mean to gain advantage or avoid confrontation. Social media has arguably made this worse, giving everyone a public platform to craft their ideal persona while hiding their actual messy reality. If Diogenes were alive today, he'd probably have a field day with Instagram influencers presenting perfect lives while being utterly miserable. Politicians making campaign promises they have no intention of keeping. Corporations issuing press releases about values they violate daily. And everyone performing authenticity as just another mask to wear. He'd probably be walking through shopping malls with his lamp, examining people's faces as they buy things they don't need, with money they don't have, to impress people they don't like. He'd be at political rallies, holding his lamp up to candidates and supporters alike. He'd be in universities, examining professors who teach ethics while engaging in academic politics that would make Machiavelli blush. But here's the uncomfortable part. If Diogenes walked up to us with his lamp, examining our faces in his search for an honest person, would we pass the test? Most of us would probably fail, not because we're terrible people, but because we're all socialized to moderate our honesty, to tell polite lies, to present ourselves strategically depending on context. We say, "I'm fine," when we're not. We congratulate people on achievements we secretly envy. We claim to care about issues we forget about 5 minutes later. We present our best selves on social media while hiding our struggles. We're all, to varying degrees, doing exactly what the Athenians were doing, maintaining a gap between our public persona and private reality.
Diogenes would argue that this gap is the source of much of our unhappiness. The effort of maintaining these masks, remembering what you said to whom, managing different versions of yourself for different audiences, worrying about whether people will discover who you really are, this all creates anxiety and prevents genuine connection with others. His solution was radical simplification. Be exactly one thing consistently to everyone all the time. Own nothing that requires maintenance or protection, want nothing that depends on others' cooperation, need nothing that can be taken away. Say what you mean what you say, and don't worry about who approves or disapproves. It's an appealing philosophy in some ways, this idea of complete freedom through complete detachment. But it's also demanding in ways most people aren't willing to accept. Diogenes gave up everything: family, home, possessions, comfort, reputation, social connection, and any form of conventional success. In exchange, he got freedom from worry, fear, and dependence. Most people look at that trade-off and decide the price is too high. We want freedom, but we also want comfort. We want honesty, but we also want to maintain relationships that require some level of polite dishonesty. We admire Diogenes from a distance, while having no intention of following his example. And maybe that's okay. Diogenes wasn't trying to convert everyone to cynicism. He was making a point, offering an extreme example that would make people think about their own choices. You don't have to live in a jar to appreciate his critique of materialism. You don't have to own nothing to recognize that owning too much can own you. You don't have to achieve perfect honesty to see the value in being more authentic. The lantern search was never really about finding an honest person. It was about making everyone think about honesty, about examining themselves instead of just being examined. The genius of the gesture was that it turned the tables. Diogenes looked like the crazy one, walking around with an unnecessary lamp, but he was really making everyone else look in the mirror and ask uncomfortable questions. Some ancient sources say Diogenes eventually gave up his lantern search, not because he found an honest person, but because he'd made his point and moved on to other provocations. Others say he continued searching until his death, a lifetime quest that served as a permanent indictment of human society. Diogenes died in 323 BCE, the same year as Alexander the Great, which feels appropriate somehow. The conqueror and the philosopher, two men who represented opposite approaches to life, departing the world together. Alexander died from fever or poison after conquering most of the known world. Diogenes died in Corinth, probably still living in a jar, still owning nothing, still unbothered by the things that tormented other people. There are various stories about his death. One says he died from eating raw octopus. Another says he died from holding his breath deliberately, essentially willing himself to death when he decided he'd lived long enough. Both stories could be fake, but both feel true to his character. He would absolutely eat raw octopus if someone told him it was dangerous, just to prove that social conventions about food safety were overblown. And he would absolutely decide when to die, rather than letting nature or disease make that choice for him. According to some accounts, before his death, Diogenes requested to be thrown outside the city walls unburied, so wild animals could eat his body. When people protested that this was undignified, he reportedly said, "Then place a stick by my side so I can drive them away." When people pointed out that he'd be dead and couldn't use the stick, he said, "Exactly. So why should I care what happens to my body after death if I won't be aware of it?" This was vintage Diogenes, using logic to demolish conventional pieties, showing that many things we think are important are really just social performances that matter only if we care what others think. He didn't care what others thought, which made him invulnerable to social pressure and freed him to live according to his own principles. After his death, the citizens of Corinth honored him with a monument featuring a dog carved in marble, acknowledging his dog-like philosophy. It's ironic, really. The man who rejected all honors and monuments got one anyway, because people couldn't help recognizing that he'd achieved something remarkable, even if they couldn't or wouldn't follow his example. The Cynic school continued after Diogenes, producing other notable philosophers like Crates, who gave away his fortune to become homeless, and Hipparchia, one of the few female philosophers in ancient Greece, who scandalized society by living openly with Crates and practicing philosophy in public. These later Cynics carried on Diogenes' tradition of provocative street philosophy, though none quite matched his legendary status. Cynicism eventually influenced Stoicism, which took some Cynic ideas about virtue and self-control, but packaged them in a more socially acceptable form. The Stoics didn't require you to live in a jar or give away all your possessions. You could be wealthy, powerful, even an emperor like Marcus Aurelius, and still practice Stoic philosophy. This made Stoicism more popular, but arguably less radical and transformative than Cynicism. Diogenes would probably say the Stoics sold out, watering down the message to make it palatable to rich people who wanted to feel philosophical without actually giving up their luxuries. And he'd have a point. There's something admirably uncompromising about Diogenes' approach. He didn't try to make his philosophy convenient or marketable. He lived it fully, accepted all its implications, and invited others to do the same if they dared. The lantern story became his most enduring legacy, summing up his entire philosophy in one memorable image. It captured his critique of society, his commitment to honesty, his use of absurdist gestures to make serious points, and his fundamental belief that most of what humans worry about is self-imposed nonsense that distracts from the simple business of living well. Over the centuries, countless artists have depicted Diogenes with his lantern, searching through crowds of people. The image appears in paintings, sculptures, engravings, and eventually political cartoons and memes. Each generation rediscovers Diogenes and finds his critique relevant to their own time, because dishonesty, hypocrisy, and the gap between appearance and reality are apparently timeless human problems. When someone today says they'd need a lantern to find something rare, like you'd need a lantern to find a politician who keeps their promises, they're invoking Diogenes whether they know it or not.
The phrase has entered common usage as shorthand for frustrated searching for something that should be common but has become impossibly rare. It's a testament to how effectively Diogenes communicated his message that we're still using his metaphor over 2 millennia later. The lantern also represents something deeper about philosophy itself. Diogenes was arguing that philosophy shouldn't just be abstract theorizing in ivory towers. It should be lived, demonstrated, performed in public, where everyone can see it. The lantern search wasn't a lecture about honesty. It was philosophy in action, making people think by making them uncomfortable. This approach was revolutionary in its way. Before Diogenes, most Greek philosophy happened in private spaces, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, or in small groups of students gathered around a teacher. These were elite institutions accessible only to wealthy men with leisure time for study. Diogenes brought philosophy into the streets, making it accessible to everyone and demonstrating that you didn't need education or wealth to think clearly about how to live. His jar in the marketplace was like an anti-academy, a school without walls or tuition, where the curriculum was just watching Diogenes be himself and thinking about what that meant. People could learn from him whether he was searching with his lantern, insulting powerful visitors, eating in public, or just sunbathing in his jar. Every action was a lesson, every gesture a philosophical statement. The lantern search also highlights Diogenes' dark sense of humor. He wasn't a cheerful optimist thinking the best of people. He was deeply cynical in the modern sense of that word, believing that most humans were fundamentally dishonest and that society encouraged this dishonesty through its conventions and institutions. But instead of being depressed about this, he found it darkly funny and turned it into performance art. There's something almost absurdist about the image, a homeless man with a lamp searching for something he knows doesn't exist, or exists so rarely it might as well not exist, conducting this futile search day after day as a way of pointing out how ridiculous everyone else's pursuits are. It's like Samuel Beckett wrote a Greek comedy, characters going through meaningless motions while claiming they're engaged in something important. Diogenes' relationship with Plato is particularly interesting because it shows the conflict between two completely different philosophical approaches. Plato believed in ideal forms, transcendent truths, and the importance of theoretical understanding. He thought philosophers should discover eternal principles through reason and contemplation. Diogenes thought this was all nonsense, abstract games that distracted from the practical question of how to actually live. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped and Diogenes brought him a plucked chicken, he wasn't just making a joke. He was demonstrating that abstract definitions miss the essence of things, that theoretical philosophy can become a game divorced from reality. The plucked chicken was his version of the lantern search, a provocative gesture that made a serious point about the limits of abstract reasoning. Plato reportedly called Diogenes Socrates gone mad, which is both an insult and a compliment. Socrates also challenged conventional wisdom and questioned people in public, but he did it through polite dialogue and careful argument. Diogenes skipped the politeness and went straight to absurdist demonstration. He was what Socrates might have been if Socrates had been willing to completely reject social conventions instead of just questioning them. The madness Plato referred to wasn't clinical insanity, but rather a willingness to take philosophical principles to their logical extremes, regardless of social consequences. Most philosophers stop when their principles start to conflict with comfortable living. Diogenes didn't stop. He followed his logic all the way to living in a jar and owning nothing, accepting total social marginalization as the price of philosophical consistency. This uncompromising quality is what makes Diogenes both admirable and impossible to emulate. He proved it could be done, living according to his principles for decades without wavering, but he also demonstrated how extreme the commitment required was. You can't be a little bit cynic any more than you can be a little bit pregnant. It's all or nothing, and almost everyone chooses nothing. The lantern search embodied this uncompromising quality. Diogenes could have said, "Most people are dishonest, but some are decent." That would have been diplomatic, nuanced, the kind of balanced statement we expect from serious thinkers. Instead, he walked around with a lamp implying that honest people might as well not exist. It was deliberately provocative, refusing to soften the message for palatability. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of this extremism, people loved hearing about Diogenes. The stories of his encounters, his clever insults, his bizarre lifestyle choices, all became famous throughout the ancient world. People who would never dream of living like him enjoyed hearing about someone who did, vicariously experiencing radical freedom through his stories. This suggests something interesting about human nature. We admire people who completely commit to their principles even when we're not willing to do so ourselves. We enjoy moral clarity even when we live in moral ambiguity. We're entertained by radicals while remaining moderates. Diogenes understood this and used it to his advantage, becoming famous precisely because he was so extreme. The lantern became a symbol not just of searching for honesty, but of refusing to give up the search despite knowing it's probably futile. There's something noble about continuing to look for something rare and precious even when experience suggests you won't find it. It's like idealism tempered by cynicism, or cynicism that hasn't quite killed idealism. Maybe that's why the image resonates so strongly. Most of us have searched for honesty, authenticity, or genuine connection in a world full of performance and pretense. We've all had moments where we felt like we needed a lantern to find sincerity in a sea of social games. Diogenes gave us a way to express that frustration that's both serious and humorous, acknowledging the problem while laughing at its absurdity. His legacy extends beyond philosophy into literature, art, and popular culture. References to Diogenes appear in Renaissance paintings, Enlightenment essays, romantic poetry, and modern novels. Each era finds something relevant in his story, whether it's his critique of materialism, his defense of authenticity, his challenge to power, or his demonstration that happiness doesn't require conventional success. In our current age of social media performance, where everyone curates their image and influencers sell lifestyle fantasies, Diogenes feels more relevant than ever. He was the anti-influencer, someone whose entire lifestyle was designed to show that you don't need the things everyone else is trying to sell you. His jar was the opposite of a mansion tour. His threadbare cloak, the opposite of a fashion haul video. His begging bowl, the opposite of a luxury unboxing video. If Diogenes had social media, he'd probably post pictures of his empty jar with captions like, "Look at all the stuff I don't need to be happy," or selfies with his lamp in broad daylight captioned, "Still searching." He'd become either a viral sensation or get banned for violating community standards by performing bodily functions on camera to make philosophical points. But he wouldn't care about followers or likes because that would defeat his whole philosophy. The moment you start performing for an audience, you've compromised your authenticity. You're adjusting your behavior based on what others think, which is exactly what Diogenes rejected. He performed in public, but he didn't perform for the public. The distinction matters.
The lantern search teaches us something about how to deliver criticism effectively. Direct accusation often makes people defensive, but absurdist gestures that let people draw their own conclusions can be more powerful. Diogenes didn't walk around saying, "You're all dishonest." He just walked around looking for honesty and implicitly failing to find it. The critique landed harder because people reached the conclusion themselves. This technique of indirect critique through absurdist performance influenced later movements. The medieval holy fools who acted crazy to deliver spiritual truths, the court jesters who could criticize kings through humor, the Dadaists and Surrealists who used absurdity to critique society, the satirists and comedians who reveal truth through exaggeration, they all owe something to Diogenes and his lamp. There is also something profound about the specific thing Diogenes was searching for. An honest man, not a perfect man, not a wise man, not a powerful or wealthy man, just an honest one. This suggests that honesty is the foundation of all other virtues. If you can't be honest about what you think and feel and want, if you're constantly performing for others, then any other virtues you claim are suspect because they might also be performances.
Honesty, in Diogenes' sense, meant living in alignment with your nature and your values, saying what you mean and meaning what you say, acting the same way regardless of who's watching. It's a simple concept, but devastatingly difficult to practice consistently. We are all dishonest in small ways every day, adjusting our presentation, telling white lies, pretending to feel things we don't feel. Diogenes would say these small dishonesties accumulate into a fundamentally inauthentic life, where you're not really sure who you are because you've performed so many different versions of yourself for so many different audiences. The solution is radical simplification. Be exactly one thing, consistently, and accept that some people won't like it. Freedom comes from not caring what they think. This brings us back to the lantern and its light. Light in philosophy often represents truth, knowledge, or clarity. Diogenes was using light to search for truth in human form, for someone living authentically. But the joke is that he needed artificial light in broad daylight, suggesting that natural light, natural clarity about human behavior, reveals only dishonesty. You need something extra, some special illumination, to find the rare exception. Or maybe the lamp was really for everyone else. Maybe Diogenes was providing light so people could examine themselves, see their own dishonesty clearly, recognize the gap between who they pretend to be and who they really are. The lamp was a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths back at anyone who encountered it. As the years passed and Diogenes continued his searches, the lantern must have become a familiar sight in Athens. People probably pointed him out to visitors. That's Diogenes with his lamp, looking for an honest man. No, he never finds one. Yes, he does this every day. No, I don't think he's actually crazy. Well, maybe a little crazy, but in a philosophical way. And maybe some people, seeing him day after day with his lamp, started examining themselves more carefully. Maybe a merchant decided to be more honest in his dealings. Maybe a politician thought twice before making a promise he couldn't keep. Maybe an ordinary citizen recognized their own small hypocrisies and tried to do better. If so, the lantern search succeeded not by finding what it looked for, but by inspiring others to become what it sought. This is perhaps the deepest reading of the lantern story. Diogenes wasn't really searching for an honest person because he knew he wouldn't find one. He was creating a permanent challenge, a visible reminder that honesty matters and that we're all falling short. The search itself was the point,
not the destination. The question was the answer.
In the end, Diogenes' lamp illuminated more than he probably intended. It showed the gap between human ideals and human behavior. It revealed the elaborate social performances we all engage in. It demonstrated that radical authenticity is possible, but requires giving up things most people aren't willing to lose. And it proved that humor and absurdity can be powerful philosophical tools, sometimes more effective than serious argument. The image of a ragged philosopher holding a lamp in daylight, searching for something precious and rare in a world of pretense and performance, captured something essential about the human condition. We're all searching for authenticity, honesty, and genuine connection, even when we're not sure they exist. We're all holding lamps in the darkness, hoping to find what we've almost given up hope of finding. And maybe, just maybe, the light we carry while searching is more important than what we find. The attempt to live honestly and authentically, even if we fail constantly, might be what matters. Diogenes never found his honest man, but he became one himself through the searching. The lantern lit his path, even when it didn't reveal his destination. So that's the story of Diogenes and the lantern, a philosopher who lived in a jar, owned nothing, feared no one, and walked through Athens with a lamp, looking for honesty in a dishonest world. He didn't find what he was looking for, but he found something else, immortality through a single perfect gesture that still resonates across the centuries, reminding us that searching for truth and authenticity is worth doing, even when, especially when, everyone around us has given up the search. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient Athens and the mind of history's most uncompromising philosopher. I hope Diogenes and his lamp gave you something to think about as you drift off. Goodbye for now, and remember, keep searching, even in broad daylight.